With over 60 million copies sold across 9 mainline entries, 6 spin-offs, a few remakes, an arcade game, and even a Pachi slot, Metal Gear has solidified itself as a gaming staple. But for every game that saw release, there's a cancelled one that never saw the light of day. In this video, we're gonna cover over a dozen scrapped Metal Gear projects, like a sandbox Sorrow game, another starring the boss in World War II, Metal Gear Solid Rising, Mina no Metal Gear, kind of a PSP MMORPG almost, a TCG, and quite a few more. Some were just pitches and unfruitful Kojima ideas, others entered full production, and the rest fall somewhere in between. We'll start with the Sorrow game, the boss in the big one, and Rising, since we got some new info and all three kinda bleed into each other. Back around 2008, when Metal Gear Solid 4 was more or less finished, there was a pitch within Konami for a prequel starring Snake Eater boss the Sorrow. In 2023, longtime Metal Gear artist Takahiro Omori tweeted out, quote, "About 15 years ago, I submitted plans for a game about a young Sorrow sneaking through a sandbox, but then Murokoshi's free-cutting Raiden project got the green light, and later Kojima Productions' Mineshi changed a lot, and it eventually became Platinum's." As you can see, Omori deleted that tweet pretty quick, but we managed to screenshot it just before. In other words, there was a pitch within Kojima Productions for a Sorrow sandbox game, but they ended up going with Metal Gear Solid Rising instead. Ultimately, GamePro didn't have the skill to make Rising themselves, so Platinum Games took over and turned it into Revengeance. Hold that thought, we'll circle back to Rising here in a minute. Around the same time as that Sorrow sandbox pitch, Kojima was cooking up an idea of his own. It'd focus on all the Snake Eater bosses, aka the Cobra unit, fighting in World War II at Normandy. For folks watching that aren't super familiar with World War II, if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, that was Normandy, most famous for the Americans' D-Day beach offensive. According to Kojima, Metal Gear Solid 4 wrapped up in 2008, and the development team took post-project time off right after that. But of course, we were in a situation where we had to start planning for MGS5, so I started coming up with several ideas. I had several ideas for a game featuring the boss and the Cobra unit during the invasion of Normandy. I then handed these plans over to the team so they could take over and make the game. I presented my ideas to the team during the summer of 2008. However, simply dropping MGS5 on the younger staff members was a bit heavy, and there was resistance to doing it without my involvement. The project was on Kojima's mind for quite a while actually. 4 years later at a PAX Q&A he said, "I talked previously about a game featuring the boss as the main character, and this is something I'd really love to make. If I do make that game, it won't be a spin-off. I'd like to make it part of the main series." He brought it up again to UK GamesTM Magazine, and by 2014 he was even location scouting in Normandy. But unfortunately, that game never got made, and his relationship fractured with Konami soon after, resulting in him losing control of the Metal Gear franchise. Instead of the Sorrow and Cobra unit games, after MGS4, Kojima Productions went down a different route instead, an open-world slice-em-up starring Raiden. They called it Metal Gear Solid Rising, and it was going to be the first title using the brand new Fox engine. Taking place between MGS2 and 4, Rising would have filled in some gaps and explained how 2009's Pretty Boy turned into 2014's badass cyborg. That much was already known, but we managed to track down some devs to get the inside scoop on more details. They weren't authorized to divulge those details, so we've been asked to keep their identities anonymous. So let's pull back the curtain. Metal Gear Solid Rising was a 3-act tale of revenge and rescue taking place over 2 to 3 years. At the outset, Raiden's not a cyborg yet. He's fully human. His mission is to rescue Olga's child, who's held captive by a wealthy American financier named Wexler. Wexler's keeping her at Area 51, the US military facility. Raiden breaks her free, but Wexler captures him, forces Raiden's partner Vespa to pull out his intestines, then Wexler crushes Raiden's jaw with his bare hands, leaving his tongue hanging down his chest. Fade to black. More than a year later, Raiden has a new black cybernetic body and is being force-fed heavy memory suppressants. Now he's the barely human Black Raiden. This was described to us as a dark part of the game, with Black Raiden now working for Wexler, and the player constantly reminded that every person you kill is a good guy. Eventually, you fight a psychic Japanese guy who appears to Raiden as Solid Snake, Snake's only appearance in the entire game by the way, and afterwards Raiden gradually starts to recover his memory. He manages to locate Vespa, and together they break out of Wexler's compound. Raiden's black suit gets damaged in the process, so Dr. Petrovic Madinar builds him a new one. It's a white suit, because now he's fighting for the side of justice. Then White Raiden and Vespa set out for revenge on Wexler. Regrettably, we couldn't get exact details of the ending, but you can probably piece it together roughly if you're familiar with Metal Gear lore. Rising would have been an essential part of the game's main continuity that explained why Raiden changed so drastically between MGS 2 and 4, to not only see but experience how he got brutalized, why he's got the trauma about murder, and how he ended up in his cyborg body. The setting was described as futuristic, much more so than MGS 4, despite taking place earlier in the timeline. Producer Shigenobu Matsuyama stated publicly that there would definitely be an online mode, and very likely some functionality with Xbox Kinect and PlayStation Move. This was all happening pretty much at the height of the motion controls craze, back in the late 2000s, early 2010s. Unfortunately, the game itself was an unplayable mess. Kojima Productions envisioned an open world where Raiden can cut absolutely anything to pieces, running at 60 frames a second. A short gameplay trailer to that effect was shown at E3 2010, but our inside sources tell us it was entirely pre-rendered. In reality, the game ran at more like 10 frames a second, because, simply put, Kojipro didn't have the programming chops to turn their vision into reality. So the project was handed off to Platinum Games, who transformed it into Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, which they made start to finish in just 9 months, with a totally different story. Raiden's black suit from Rising was repurposed for Vengeance, and little else. Ultimately, Platinum's spin-off got solid reviews and was a commercial success, and Kojima was public about wanting to make a sequel. As far as Rising 2 is concerned, I really do have that in my mind and I want to make it, he said. And if we do make it, it would definitely be with Platinum. I don't think anyone else could do it. And personally, I think if we're gonna make a sequel to Rising, it should feature Frank Yeager as a main character versus zombies. Nano machine-powered zombies. That's what I'm proposing to Platinum and the producer of the project. But they seem to be ignoring me. I said I'll even write the story for it, but they said, no, that's okay, don't worry about it. Kojima actually wanted the original Rising to star Yeager, the katana-wearing cyborg ninja also known as Gray Fox, but his team was passionate about using Raiden instead, so he reluctantly let them have their way. Alright, let's wind the clock back a bit. Back to the mid-90s, when Hideo Kojima was working on Policenauts for Panasonic's console the 3DO, he heard through the grapevine about a machine with specs that made real 3D possible. And it was fast, as opposed to the sort of half-assed 3D you can do on the 3DO. This revolutionary console would come to be known as the Sony PlayStation. In the 148th episode of Hidechan Radio, which is a now-defunct Kojima Productions podcast hosted by the man himself, Kojima said he'd planned to develop a third Metal Gear for 3DO, but its processing power was weaker than the soon-to-be-released PlayStation.
PlayStation の部署ではなく 3D をやりましょうと。
To work within 3DO's limits, Kojima considered making the environment 3D, but the characters only 2D. His lead artist, Yoji Shinkawa, expounded on that in a 1997 issue of Konami Magazine, saying, I think the image Kojima had for Snake was the face of Christopher Walken with the flexibility and muscles of Jean-Claude Van Damme, because originally, we were planning to use digitized live-action characters on top of polygonal environments. Metal Gear 3 never came out on 3DO, but a little piece of it still exists. If you have the 3DO Policenauts pilot disc, by searching deep in the Japanese glossary, you can see Yoji Shinkawa's artwork for a very early rendition of Foxhound, who of course eventually found their way into Metal Gear Solid, almost 4 years later. Here's a translation of the disc's text, which summarizes Foxhound's role in the first 2 games and hints at what's to come in the future. There's also concept art of Meryl and Snake, where he does look a little like Christopher Walken. After Metal Gear Solid launched on PlayStation and blew everyone's minds, a portable reimagining was announced for the GameCom. The GameCom was a failed portable, so you'd be forgiven if you've never heard of it. They were produced by Tiger Electronics, the company probably most famous for making one-game handhelds like these in the 80s and 90s. Fun fact, they actually made one for Snake's Revenge.
I've got rations. Oh.
Glorified calculator games, honestly. But unlike those cheap standalones, the GameCom made use of actual cartridges, and some big-name games actually came to the console, like Duke Nukem and Resident Evil. The Nintendo Game Boy was running scared. Well, not really. The GameCom never even managed to sell 1 million units. As a result, the handheld was discontinued, and some titles that had already been announced ended up getting cancelled. Sonic 3D Blast, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and of course, Metal Gear Solid. Magazine coverage at the time described it as a port of the PS1 game, but also emphasizing the rescue of hostages, which would have been more in line with the original Metal Gear from '87. Sounds like a mix of both games essentially. It would have been an interesting novelty in the series' history, but probably wouldn't have been much fun, especially by modern standards. Our efforts to learn more from the uncredited devs were mostly unfruitful. They didn't want to talk, so it's unclear how far along in development the game even was. Footage has never been made public, but seeing the GameCom port of Resident Evil 2 will give you a pretty good idea of what we missed out on. We could have had this, but Metal Gear. Truly, we live in the worst timeline. The early 2000s were a heyday for trading card games. Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Dragon Ball, Lord of the Rings. It seemed like every popular IP was getting in on the action. Even Metal Gear. Almost. In the document of Metal Gear Solid 2 Interactive Disc, there's a section briefly revealing the cancelled MGS TCG. Fans could battle and torture each other with Sons of Liberty characters like Raiden, Pliskin, and Fortune, using weapons, traps, and command cards. We won't spend too much time on this one because it's a card game, but we did have the cards translated if you want to pause to read and get a better idea of how the game was played. Each card had its own range, cost, abilities, and so on. Unfortunately, the rules weren't explained in depth, and the cards are apparently unfinished, with mostly copy-pasted text. That said, in broad terms, it does look similar to how the cards in Metal Gear Acid ended up functioning a few years later, so it seems the overall concept got reworked to become an actual video game. And thus, tragically, no Metal Gear booster packs with first edition holographic vamps that are eventually worth more than your house. After Metal Gear Solid 4's launch, fans were expecting an eventual deluxe edition, maybe a year or so down the road, similar to how Integral, Substance, and Subsistence added new content and features to the first 3 games. But MGS4's upgrade never came, and it wasn't till a couple years later that Kojima explained why. Talking on his Japanese Twitter account, he said he was just too busy, that he'd like to see a complete edition with trophy support and 3D, but doing so would mean less time to craft a brand new game. He hoped someone else could make it for him, but no one did. We talked to MGS4's assistant producer Ryan Payton, who filled us in a little more on the behind-the-scenes considerations for MGS4 Substance, like an underground escort mission with Big Mama in Eastern Europe that was 65% complete, and some stuff with the Rat Patrol in the Middle East. Some voiceover work was already done. We covered all that in depth in our MGS Cut content video a couple years back, so we won't rehash it all here. You can go back and watch that previous video if you want to learn more. But as far as why it never got made, Ryan did have this to add.
The experience of MGS4 was that I feel like Hideo was able to get a lot of ideas that most teams would have taken 7 years to build for at hundreds of millions of dollars. Him and the team were able to get that in the game. And I suspect that there was less on the cutting room floor on MGS4 than there was on MGS3 that would justify like a subsistence version or a substance version.
As of the making of this video, Metal Gear Solid 4 is still famously stuck on PlayStation 3. It can't run on PS4 or 5, or any other console for that matter. But Konami actually made an Xbox 360 port, which if it had been released, would presumably be playable on modern Xbox consoles even today through backwards compatibility, just like the 2011 HD collection. So if it was finished, why didn't it get released? According to Ryan Payton, Microsoft was desperate to get the game on their platform. He went on to say, "One fateful day, the Konami R&D team hosted a meeting where we got to see the fruits of their labor, Metal Gear Solid 4 running beautifully and smoothly on an Xbox 360. It looked almost identical to the PS3 version, but because the game was around 50 gigabytes in size, which fit fine on one PS3 Blu-ray disc, Konami would have had to ship the Xbox 360 version as a half dozen or so DVDs. The internet would have laughed at us." Kojima was also opposed to the concept of ports altogether, and explained that a game like MGS4 built specially for PS3 wouldn't be a good fit on other consoles, and therefore releasing such a port would be disloyal to fans. After a while, he said he was, quote, fed up with people asking for it. But then they released the aforementioned HD collection on 360 soon after. And nowadays, literally every Metal Gear is playable on Xbox except MGS4. So take that for what you will. Another interesting port from a historical perspective was an Amiga version of the original Metal Gear. For the younger folks watching, the Amiga was a home computer released in '87, with 16-bit graphics considered ahead of its time. For example, here's the Amiga playing Shadow of the Beast. Looks pretty advanced compared to an NES game, doesn't it? Metal Gear was slated for the Amiga, and Konami even got as far as advertising it, but it never came out. Metal Gear's NES port was famously very different compared to Kojima's original release on the MSX2 home computer. The NES version even went on to get its own direct sequel, Snake's Revenge, which isn't part of the mainline series. The canned Amiga port would have been handled by the same team who did the NES version, a company called Banana Development. Talking to GamesTM Magazine in 2011, Banana employee Charles Ernst explained why the NES version turned out the way it did, and addressed the long-forgotten Amiga port as well. You can pause and read, but long story short, when he was porting MSX to NES, he wasn't provided a debug version to work from, and couldn't rip graphics directly from the ROM like he'd usually do. So Ernst had to just kinda play it himself and videotape it, then do his best to replicate everything within the NES's limitations. Took him 7 months. As far as the Amiga port, he said, quote, "There were plans to create an Amiga version, but it was shelved after most publishers dropped the Amiga due to piracy. Our company was supposed to port the Amiga version, and we did the box art mock-ups to encourage Konami. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that Amiga port's locked in a vault somewhere, maybe to get leaked someday for curious fans to finally get to play." According to Ernst, he's 99% certain it never got made. Those advertised Amiga screenshots had different graphics than any port that did get released, but they're likely just mock-ups. Speaking of which, besides the NES and MSX versions, back in the day, Metal Gear also got unique Commodore 64 and MS-DOS ports, so there's still plenty alternate versions of Zanzibar Land for Mega fans to explore. The MS-DOS version even has cutscenes not found anywhere else, if you want to call them that. Charles Ernst did that port too, by the way. Moving on. Released in 2006, Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops was an interesting project, as it was almost 2 completely different games before it settled into its final form. One of them simple to explain, the other is not so simple. We'll start with that one, the complicated one. It was born from Kojima's ideas for a new IP, which he then grafted Metal Gear onto, resulting in an Animal Crossing Metal Gear Frankenstein. He called it Mina no Metal Gear, or Everyone's Metal Gear in English. Kojima wrote about it on his blog in 2009, and it's difficult to summarize, so we'll just quote him at length. Translated into English, he wrote, "Everyone's Metal Gear." That was the tentative title I wrote in the planning drafts that preceded Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. I wrote the draft based on the idea that it was possible to create a full-fledged action game for the PSP. With no time to spare, I decided to take elements I planned for a separate original title and bring them to the PSP version of MGS. That was Everyone's Metal Gear. But I'd like to expound a little on the original plan before it became Metal Gear. Upon buying, turning on, and starting up the game, the world is empty except for the player. As the player progresses through the story, they encounter many people and worlds to increase the number of inhabitants in their own world, who they can become friends with. Any friend can be used as a player. However, there are no continues. When you get a game over, a dead player cannot be used again. Players increase their number of friends through various forms of communication, such as story mode, competitive and cooperative play, chance encounters, and AP soldiers, that is, soldiers that used to be in ops, who become friends when they connect to an access point. Put simply, you start out alone in the world, and by taking your PSP on the go and communicating with people and places in the real world, you increase your world's inhabitants. The more you play and the more you interact with the real world, the more inhabitants you'll have in the game world, which will eventually become your friends, who serve as your troops. And in order to create troops, it's important to have a relationship with everyone, people and regions that live in the real world. Rather than competing to get friends, the system's that if you get to know people, they'll be registered in your PSP and appear in your world. For example, let's say persons A, B, C, and D all have their players fight to the death. Then there's winners and losers, but if a player dies, they don't come back. However, the other player's characters that you came in contact with there will become real in your PSP world, even if they don't become your friends. In this way, the number of registered players in your world increased to 100, 500, or 1,000, and so on. The more people and places you interact with, the more inhabitants you have in your world. There are stories, events, and missions to turn those registered players into friends. There's also competitive and cooperative play. The project that brought this idea to MGS was Everyone's Metal Gear. I was busy with preparations for MGS4, so I entrusted this project to a producer and director other than myself. After many twists and turns, it eventually morphed into Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops." End quote. You can see how some of those ideas did eventually make their way into Portable Ops through its connectivity features, which paved the way for Mother Base in future installments. Kojima's long desired to create a game with no continues, and we'll touch on that soon in a sister video to this one, exploring all Kojima's unrealized ideas for new IP and non-Metal Gear projects. So subscribe if you don't want to miss it. As for the other pre-Portable Ops concept, the simpler one, we covered it a couple years ago, but it's arguably more on topic now than it was back then, so we'll briefly reiterate. According to Ryan Payton, another early version of Portable Ops would have been a PSP game that lets you relive series history through a gauntlet of boss battles. The game would have run on the Subsistence engine and focused on local and online multiplayer. In other words, a portable co-op boss rush campaign covering the full franchise timeline. Ryan told us, "Those initial ideas probably only survived for a month or two, in terms of it being more boss-focused. This is just my interpretation of what was going on in those early days, which was, how do we create an authentic Metal Gear experience for PlayStation Portable that satisfies fans, perhaps more than the Acid series up to that point? And also, how do we get that game out the door fairly quickly?" So the idea was to dust off existing boss battles and add some co-op elements to it as well. But those ideas didn't last very long because we quickly pivoted towards what ended up becoming Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. After that early premise fell by the wayside, Portable Ops was developed at a breakneck speed with just 9 months development time. We'll cover this next one pretty quick because it was cancelled, but then it got uncancelled a couple years later. It's still unreleased though as of this video's writing, and it's not a video game. It's Metal Gear Solid the board game, and a pretty high-end board game at that, designed by a hotshot in the industry, with intricately crafted pieces, and initially priced at $125. That's an expensive board game. It was originally announced in 2018, and prototypes were made playable at conventions, but in 2021 the license deal fell apart. When the news broke, we got in touch with the game's designer, Emerson Matsuuchi, to get an inside scoop on the story and how it would have played. You could maybe think of Matsuuchi like the Kojima of board games. He previously designed Spectre Ops and its sequel Broken Covenant, both of which focus on stealth, strategy, and got stellar reviews. So seeing him make Metal Gear his next project was intriguing. Its cancellation was even more intriguing. That made it a forbidden fruit we'd never get to taste. We kept in touch with Matsuuchi over 2 years while the deal was in limbo, which delayed this video considerably. Recently, headway was made, and now the game's back on track. It's currently available for $100 pre-orders, scheduled to release about a month after this video goes up. So, good news, you're gonna get to play it. Bad news? We lost our scoop. Oh well. Story-wise, it's basically a retelling of MGS1, and as far as gameplay, well, it's stealth espionage action. It comes with VR missions, a 109-page integrated graphic novel, and seems like a worthy experience for 1 to 4 Metal Gear fans who like board games. This is starting to sound like an ad, isn't it? It ain't, I promise. We spent a lot of time tracking this story, so even though it's now uncancelled, we still felt compelled to talk about it. Hopefully it doesn't get recancelled. And finally, the Metal Gears Kojima wanted to get remakes. Snake Eater's currently in development, but that's not actually one of the games he wanted to see brought up to modern standards. A little while before Ground Zeroes came out, at E3 a fan asked for remakes of Solid 1 and 2 in the Fox engine, the same engine that powers MGS5. Kojima said 2 didn't need a remake, however the first game could definitely use one. But he hoped someone else could make it for him, that there's a studio out there who could put in the love and passion it deserves. Over the next couple years, Kojima started thinking that maybe, actually, he'd like to do it himself. At the next Gamescom, he said, "If I was having some of my staff members going back to remaking a game, I would go with Metal Gear Solid 1. Of course, I would not want to make a standard remake. Something similar to what Planet of the Apes is doing, taking the best of the past and doing it in a very modern style and bringing something brand new. Then at the next year's Taipei Game Show, quote, I would like to play around with Shadow Moses as an open world, so I think MGS1 would be good, but no one's interested in making it. We have the engine, the tools, and the people. It's one that most deserves a remake. Regarding the first two Metal Gears, the ones on MSX, Kojima said Ground Zeroes and Phantom Pain brought the series story full circle, but in the process some contradictions slipped through and continuity broke in some places. He said ideally he'd like to remake both to fix their stories and bring the games up to snuff, but it'd require a huge team, and at the moment he couldn't spare the manpower. Kojima's famous falling out and eventual exit from Konami came soon after. So unfortunately, we'll probably never get to see those broken connections reforged on modern consoles, which probably applies to all the games described in today's video. Did you also know that Kojima wanted to let players keep rats as pets in MGS1? And that the Snake Eater 3DS remake had 69 extra ops hidden in its internal data, a lot of which are finished and fully playable? For a full hour of Metal Gear Solid cut content hosted by David Hayter himself, click the video on screen. Special thanks to our Japanese translator Jacob, Arkhound for consultation, and especially BadHumans for writing and fact-checking. And thank you for watching. See you next time.